Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session, the second session in the Badiou week. Professor Badiou on Badiou. And I'd just like to welcome you all here from different parts of the world and everyone here in the room. This is fantastic. We had a great day yesterday. Last night we met and we had small group meetings and we talked about various questions that we could pose to Professor Badiou, as well as surprises that emerged naturally through yesterday's very illuminating talk. At this point, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our Vice President, Professor Asfar Hussain, who will then introduce us to the main speaker, Professor Badiou. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Actually, I think Kristen has already started it and introduced some of the things. And so today, Professor Badiou is going to cover a very significant period in his life, which is, the period is from 1968 to 1988. It's 20 years. And he will talk to us about his life and work, or rather life work during this particular period. And without further ado, I would invite Professor Badiou to talk. Professor Badiou.
I begin by answering 4 questions. First question, could you elaborate on the role of the theater in the formation of your philosophical thought? In particular, what are the affinities between the philosopher and the character of the clown? Beside Molière, what playwrights have been prominent in your thinking? It's a question of clown. Beside Molière, playwrights have been prominent in your thinking. It's a question of clown.
When people join in the Hangout, could you please mute your microphones, please? Thank you.
I think there has been a contradiction from the very beginning between philosophy and theater, in fact. In Plato, we can find violent critiques of theater, because theater is imitation of the reality and not the reality itself. So there is something like a kingdom of images, kingdom of imitations in the field of theater. But in the same Plato, we find that all the philosophical explanation is disposed in a theater form. Because it is discussion between some characters, Socrates and Callicles, and so on. And so, in some sense, the beginning of the philosophy itself is in theatrical form. So it's a paradoxical situation, really interesting, you know. Inside the theatrical form of philosophy, the dialogues of Plato, we find violent critiques against the theater. So we can think something like that. There is a close relationship between theater and philosophy, in fact. But it's also something like a rivalry, something like the same goal by different means. The goal of philosophy, generally speaking, is to create new conditions for thinking and for life. Something like an emancipation of humanity as such. But the goal of theater is not so different, because theater is something like an exposition of the contradiction in the human life, of the different possibilities of human life. And very often it's an exposition of the way to find a new freedom. It is, for example, in the comedy, generally, we have the fight between young men and women and the old law, and it's always the history, the complex history of the victory of love against the traditional law, and so on. So in theater, we have something like a concrete and aesthetic vision of what could be something like a different way for living. But in some sense, it's the same thing by completely different means in philosophy, by conceptual means, but the goal is in some sense the same. So we can have two positions from the point of view of the philosopher. First position, to be strongly against the theater. We must kill the rival. Second position, to do theater, to be inside theater. It has been, in fact, the solution of Plato himself. I write good plays. You know that today, very often, Plato is on the stage. Many dialogues of Plato are played in the stage. And so, my master Sartre is also a playwright, and Rousseau too was a playwright, and so on. And so I prefer peace to war, and I prefer to become a playwright than to write against theater. That is for the first question. Second question, do you think that the creation of the new subject that occurs with the event also involves a certain kind of death of the self? It's a very interesting question, which is in the tradition, the idea of the death of the old man for the birth of the new man. It's present in religious tradition too, this question of the death of the old man. for the creation and the birth of something new. And in my language, the question is different. For me, human being is first an individual, not a subject properly. It's an individual. Sometimes I name this individuality the human animal. We are all human animals. And the form of existence of the human animal is to be an individual. And so the question of the subject is the question of the transformation of the individual into a subject. The universality, the equality of all that is that I affirm that every individual is able to become a subject. It's not an aristocratic point of view. Some magnificent individual become subjects and the poor, common individual does not become a subject. No. It's the definition of humanity as such that every individual can become a subject. Can become a subject in the field of love, in the field of artistic creation, in the field of politics, in the field of science, for example. So it's possibilities, a universal possibility to become a subject. And the subject, in my vision, is not the death of the individual. The individual is, in some sense, the support of the subject, the animal support of the subject, the life, in some sense, of the subject. The subject is not something which comes after the individual and by the death of the individual. It's really a transformation of the individual itself in the subject. So we always find in the subject itself something like a trace of the individual existence. And so it's a positive transformation and not a death and a resurrection. The subject is not the resurrection of the death individual, but a new form of existence of the individual as such. All that in the details is complex, naturally. But I think you understand the general idea. And after all, it's a concrete experience. It's a concrete personal experience. When you are in the enthusiasm of a big political protest, or when you fall in love, or when you suddenly understand a very complex mathematical proof, after many years of impossibility to understand anything, all that is a moment where we have the real experience of the becoming a subject, beyond the limit of our existence as a common human animal. And so the abstract and conceptual explanation of all that is complex, but the idea is in some sense simple. And everybody, in fact, knows that it exists the possibility to become something which is not reducible to the strict individuality. And is the opening of the individual to universality, the possibility to everybody to be open to something universal. If we deny this point, we are closed in individuality, and we are closed in rivalry between individuals. So we are closed in fact, the capitalistic world. where there is only the interest of the individuals. If we cannot accept that form of existence is definitive, you must understand how we can become something which is open to universality. And my name for this transformation is subject. Okay, it's clear. Other question. Given your experience of being exposed to the other and your interest in your relationship to the other, why have you rejected a political of difference? Don't an exposure to the singularity of the other and invaluable condition of what you describe as breakthrough whereby truth can be revealed? Aren't you an oui. There's a word that I cannot clearly read. You read the phrase.
I'll try to. Aren't you an example of how politics of difference, the event of May 1968 having a universal addressing?
Okay. Finish.
Wouldn't France be able to experience a breakthrough in terms of discussing the truth about what currently seems to be an intractable vis-a-vis the
So, the world, in general, in my opinion, cannot be a question of difference. Why? Because difference is the general law of what exists. Differences are everywhere. Two individuals are absolutely different in some sense. There is a scale where you can perfectly say that me and the other are completely different. So differences are not a problem because the difference is an ontological law of what exists. Two flowers are different. Two objects are different. And naturally, two countries and two persons and two groups of human beings are different. So, when a difference becomes a problem, like in the historical context of racial difference, difference between women and men, and so on, it's the becoming problematic of the difference which is a problem, and not the difference. You know, there is no reason to exhibit the difference as a problem as such, because it's to say that in some sense, being itself is a problem. It's problematic, you know. So, my position is not that a rejection of the question of difference, but my position is to say that the question is not the difference, but the apparition of a problem of the difference. And so, the recognition of difference, which is the idea of the ethic of difference. The recognition of difference, in my opinion, is not the question. Everybody recognizes the difference. The racist recognizes the difference much more than everybody. He says that the black man is completely different of the humanity of the white man and so on. So to have an idea and a recognition of the difference is not an ethical vision. The ethical vision is to say that beyond the difference exists equality. That is the true maxim. Naturally, to affirm the equality, you must recognize the difference. And it's a true problem, because very often, many people say that they are for equality under the condition that the other would be the same. So, the true problematic of difference is to recognize equality in front of the reality of difference. So there is two negative positions, finally, on this question of difference. First, to transform the difference into a problem. Because it's absurd. It's absurd. Finally, in this vision, we can perfectly say that the simple existence of something else is a problem. So the first negative position is to transform differences in a problem, racial, national, sexual, and so on. And the second negative position is to say, okay, I accept equality, but if the other is the same. In France, we know this problem under the name of integration. Integration signifies that the others, the immigrants, the Arabic people, Arabic workers, or African workers, and so on, must be the same if I accept their existence. And it is why they cannot have customs, languages, and so on different. So this orientation is the idea that identity is more important than difference, and that I accept difference inside some form of identity. Naturally, identities exist. Once more, like difference. When we are a difference, we have an identity. Because difference is always the difference between two identities. So the recognition of identities is also a form of the recognition of difference. But if you begin to say that, okay, that sort of identity is a difference, okay, I accept differences, but this identity is a bad identity, I don't accept this identity. In fact, you don't accept difference. And so, the maxim of equality, which is, in my opinion, the fundamental political maxim, maybe in some sense, the unique political maxim, universal maxim, has for condition to accept differences, but it's not a problem, to don't constitute the difference as a problem, and also to accept the difference of identities inside the generalization of the existence of humanity as such. Because humanity is composed of different identities, and it's certainly true forever. It is why I don't think that it's a good orientation to propose a politic of difference. Naturally, you must say that the difference cannot be recognized for a reason for rejection of negativity. So the true concept is equality. And under equality, we can have a complete understanding of identities, difference, and so on. I was intrigued by the prominence of the question in your young life and your memories of the different status that your mother and the Arabic woman had. Given your rejection, did these early memories impact your thinking? You know, it's the same question in other form. In fact, retroactively, I can perfectly understand my trouble, my suspect trouble, when I was with the Arabic woman in the kitchen of the house. I have said it was a revelation of the existence of women who are different from my mother. It's true. It was in some sense the recognition of difference, in fact. But it was recognition of difference with a position which was not clear for the baby, but with a position which is a position of inequality. So there is two points in this primitive experience. First, the recognition of difference, and difference not only in general, but the very important difference for a very young boy inside the question, what is a woman? What is a woman? Is the woman exclusively my mother? Or maybe exists something else which is also a woman? And it's a very dramatic question for a boy. It's a Freudian question, you know. And every boy must have that sort of experience, the recognition of a woman which is not his mother, who is not his mother. No, it's a recognition of difference, but the trouble of that sort of experience was that without understanding all that, I understand something of the inequality. Why this woman, these women were in the kitchen and my mother in the big, magnificent rooms of our house. And so we have the complete experience in some sense. The experience, the dramatic experience of the recognition of difference concerning finally something which is of sexual nature. And inside this dramatic experience, a great trouble, which is why this different woman is in a situation of clear inequality with my mother. And so all that seems to me coherent. Thank you for these very interesting questions. And I repeat that you can write questions about all what is said here, and you will have answers. And today, I want to say something to you concerning second part, second sequence of my life and of my work. I was arrived yesterday to the paradigm of the event in my experience, which has been the uprising in France in May 1968. And so the beginning would be to return to May 1968 and to go to my first big philosophical book, Being an Event, in 1988. So 20 years. 20 years. I can give you all the details of 20 years of my life, but some points of general or universal interests. I think if we must understand this sequence and the situation at the end of the 60s of the last century, I think we must understand that there is three important points, three important determinations. A planetary revolt of educated youth, a planetary revolt of students. Very important to note that it's a completely planetary, not only in France. It's the first point. The second point is the existence of people wars against imperialism and the war for liberation. I have spoken of the Algerian War, but we have also the Vietnam War and the Palestinian War and some others. It's the second point. And the third point is the existence of big strikes of the workers in many countries. So, you know, the political situation is something like the articulation between these 3 points. A revolt of the youth, something like a revolt of workers, and the people wars in some countries. And you know that there is something like an interplay between the 3. The most clear example is that the revolt of the students here in the United States is first of all a revolt against the Vietnam War. And so there is immediately a relationship between the revolt of the educated youth in the United States and the Vietnamese War, which is a people war of liberation. And I shall explain that the very important, fundamental question in France after May 68 has been the relationship between the revolt of the students and the revolt of the workers. The political point was here. And by say some words concerning the 3 points as a descriptive situation of these 60s, the end of the 60s and a big part of the 70s, where I was first of all an activist. An activist. Now, concerning the planetary revolt of the educated youth, of the students, the point is that it's a revolt which is of ideological nature, first. There is no clear political idea at the beginning. There is a sort of political division in the movement. But there is something like a very vast ideological unity. The banner has been, in my conviction, a sentence of Mao. It's right to rebel. It's right to rebel. And the idea of revolt, the idea of it's right to rebel, we must rebel, was the general ideological framework of all this movement, this planetary movement of the students. Very often, politically, it was something obscure, but ideologically, it was the strongness of negativity. The strongness of negativity. It was an ethics of rebellion, an ethics of revolt. It was so a sort of movement against to accept. I cannot accept the world as it is. I must refuse. The contents of this refusal was not clear. And maybe it was very different in different parts of the world of the youth. But the common point was its right to rebel. Between 1966 and the middle of the 70s, we have had in China the Cultural Revolution, the beginning of which is the violent rebellion of students. The mass movement of the students against the Vietnam War in the United States. The Red Army in Japan. The Red Army faction in Germany. The Red Brigades in Italy. You know, the world was red. And I give to this year the name of Red Years. It was the Red Years. The uprising of May 68 in France. The Montoneros in Uruguay. The uprising in Czechoslovakia, and so on. It was really something with like a revolt of the youth in the world, in the complete world. It's a strange phenomenon in some sense, that uprising of all the students in the world. It was really an event in the sense of something which cannot be, which is not predictable, which is a surprise, which is an obscure beginning, with many violences. Not something quiet, not something, but something which is really a refusal, a massive contestation of the real. And from mass movement, from pacific protest to armed actions, all the possibilities of negativity exist in this time. And in any case, it's a bit confused, but it's a real negation of the world as it is. And not only the capitalistic world, but also the socialist state. It's the case in China, for example. Alors, just a parenthesis. I was personally interested very soon, before May 68, by the ideological situation in China. And I must explain why. It was the contradiction, before the Cultural Revolution, we have the contradiction between the Maoist China and the Soviet Union of Khrushchev. A big conflict, an ideological conflict, in some sense a philosophical conflict. Because it was for me this conflict between two socialist states. It was a symptom of something new in the development of the idea of communism. Something which divided the process of the communist state between two completely different orientations. And for the philosopher, it has been very interesting that the conflict was about dialectics. It's not every day that we have the conflict between two big states concerning the question of dialectics. Generally, the question of the states are not the question of dialectics, or the question of philosophical question. Much more question of army, economy, and so on. No, but that's a violent discussion concerning a very limited point of dialectics, which is the very maxim of dialectic thinking is two becomes one, so the fusion, the synthesis, or is the true law of dialectical thinking is one divides in two. You know, practically a war between China and Soviet Union about the point to know if dialectics is two fusion in one or one divide in two. Or it was very interesting, because you see that the idea that dialectics is when two different things fusion in one was the idea of a final identity between the capitalistic world and the socialist world. It was the idea of the pacific coexistence of the two, the end of the struggle of class at the level of the world. It was the position of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was in the idea of peace in some sense at any price. And so peace at any price was the idea that finally, between the revolutionary state and the normal capitalistic state, there is no crucial difference. But the Chinese position was a fighting position, and the Chinese communist was saying, in fact, there is no possible synthesis between the socialist orientation and the capitalist orientation. And there was an intellectual projection of all that at the level of the general law of dialectical thinking. And I give a lecture about this point in 1965 to have a punctuation of the development. And naturally, it's the question of is an event, is a fusion or a scission? It's a separation or is a synthesis? Is something new is always in the form of the fusion between two differences, that is an event is the end of a difference, or is an event a creation of a difference? Understand? Is the notion of rupture a notion which is a notion of separation, of something like the opening of a void between two different things, or is an event is the fusion between the reduction of a difference, a solution of a difference, a synthesis between two different things. And this is a very important discussion, because if, in some sense, an event is in the form of a fusion between two different things, it's not really the creation of a new process, but it's the end of a process. And it was the final idea of Hegel. Because for Hegel, at the end, all the contradictions are solved in the absolute idea. And so for Hegel, the history as such is the history of a new and final unity. Naturally, there is many contradictions, but the contradiction, finally, strategically, goes where final unity, and Hegel names this final unity the absolute. So the position of the Soviet Union was something like that. Finally, we are near the absolute, if you want. And the absolute is what? The absolute is that the fusion between United States and Soviet Union, something like that. Maybe it's not a very good absolute, but it's another question. And the China's position was not, no. In fact, there is no final fusion of all contradiction in one world. There is always new contradiction, new creation, new inventions. And Mao has said that even under the communism, there exist contradictions. And so the idea of Mao that after thousands and thousands years, contradictions are here and new contradictions are here. And this conflict is philosophically very important for me. It's not at all a simple question. Is the philosophical idea is finally the idea of a resorption of all contradictions in a new unity. And the fundamental idea in this case is the absolute unity. Or is finally a truth, a new truth, is always in fact a new rupture, so a new creation. The novelty of the contradiction, and not the solution of the contradiction, you know. Or, if you want, is a political proposition, is inside the process and in the direction of the peaceful solution of the process, of the historical process, or is a true political proposition is always to find something new in the modality of a rupture, a creative rupture, an affirmative rupture, but the birth, the real birth of something new. When we are in the idea, the first idea, we are always in the idea of the end of something. And it was, in these years, we have, for example, the idea of the end of philosophy, the death of philosophy. It was the idea of Heidegger, for example, and of all the school of Heidegger, the end of metaphysics. And in the aesthetic world, you have also the idea of the end of art, the end of the work of art as such, like in Duchamp and some others. And all that is the idea that we have in the moment of the end of the process. And it's a melancholic vision in some sense. all is exposed to death. And death in some sense, is the final unity is death. In death, everything are the same. And so, you see, in some sense, the affirmation, the critical, radical critical affirmation of the youth during the 60s, its right to rebel and so on, was the refusal of the acceptation of the peaceful unity. A peaceful unity was for all the young people of this time a false unity, a unity in which we have not the true life. But the idea of the true life, what is the true life? And they want the true life. The desire was the desire for the true life. And the life that the world proposed to the youth was not for them the true life. And so the idea of the true life was, as ever, confused. But the negativity was clear. Certainly, this world is not the world for the true life. What is the world for the true life? Oh, it's unclear. But we must destroy first. We must destroy first. And we shall see. Second point, people wars. Naturally, I was on the side we must destroy first. And I was at the philosophical level, and it has been my position, my definitive position, on the side that the true dialecticity of something is always at the price of a rupture, and not of the pure unity, the final unity of the process. Alors, I have spoken of the Algerian War, but you know that after that, two people wars have been of importance for us, for all of us during the 60s. The Vietnam War and the Palestinian War. And this wars was a real point of subjectivation for a big part of the rebel youth. And why? As you know, to be with the Vietnamese war and with the Palestinians was a point of subjectivation, very strong, everybody in the world. I think that the idea was that a small people is able to be victorious against a big imperialist country. That is the point, the decisive point. The weaker can be the stronger. The weaker can be the stronger. The Vietnamese people was against the most important army of the world, the army of the United States, and it was possible to be victorious in this fight. And the point is very important, because when we are desperate, when we are in resignation, when we cannot rebel, it's very often because the enemy is too strong, after all. We cannot really do something against the army of the United States, the capitalist groups, the society as it is, and so on. Everybody knows that sensibility to the strongest position of the enemy. And it's very important to create the conviction that we must obey. Finally, we must obey. And this is why the true life is impossible. The true life is impossible because we must obey. And so it was something marvelous to discover that the weaker can be the stronger. That the small Vietnamese people can be victorious in a war against the most important army of the world. So it's the first point. And today, for example, something like that is missing. We have no real example today that the small people can be victorious. But in the 60s, it was the case. And it's also an explanation of the acceptance of revolt. We must revolt. The enemy is very strong, but we are weaker than the situation. And how? How the weaker can be finally victorious? It's a question of ideology and organization. That is the point. And it was the common idea during the 60s. After that, what sort of ideology and what sort of organization was unclear. But everybody was in the idea that if the people want to be victorious in some sense, it's a question of ideology and organization. And it's my conviction, today, every political question is finally a question of ideology and organization. Naturally, we must have revolt, we must have uprising, we must have movement of mass. But at the end, to be victorious in some sense, to create something really, to go in the direction of the true life, it's a question of ideology and organization. But what is ideology? Ideology is a question of subjectivation. It's a question of the subjective determination, the organization of the subjective determination. At the philosophical level, it's very simple. It's the individual conviction that we can become a subject. But because subjectivation is a simple word to say that every individual is able to become a subject. And subjectivation is when, in the concrete world, the concrete situation, an individual discovers that this possibility, this ability to become a subject is real. That if we decide to do something now and here, you are becoming a subject. And this becoming a subject is a question of ideology, because ideology is a sort of general language, a general framework in which we can represent, we can discover, we can say in the situation how you become a subject from the point of view of your individuality. The ideology must be the ideology of revolt, the ideology in the form of a new Marxism, and so on. It's a question of situation, concrete situation. It's a question of discussion between people and so on. There is no final and transcendent ideology, naturally. The becoming subject is always in situation, in a concrete situation, and the ideological form is in relationship to the situation. But it's a question of ideology. That is a question to have an idea. Ideology is also to have an idea of what you want, what you desire, what is a true life, what is the norm for a new society, and so on. And without an idea, we cannot, in fact, enter the subjectivation. No. So it's a question of subjectivation. At the level of the transformation of the individual in a subject. But after that, the situation is a collective one. So it's also a question of organization. Question of organization is what is the new collective subject? What is the new collective organization of the subject? So, you know, in some sense, it's a dialectics between subjectivation and subject. Because a collective subject is composed of individuals, finally. So the relationship between the individual becoming a subject and the collective subject as such is the key of a political process. We have no true political process without the combination between an ideological subjectivation and a collective organization of that sort of subjectivation. So the key for a true political process, and it was the general discussion during the 60s, is the relationship between the subjectivation, which generally becomes by the negativity, the revolt, to be against, and so on, and it's a necessity. The beginning is necessary, that sort of negativity, and the becoming subject in a positive, affirmative sense. I must do something, I must decide something new. The relationship between all that, the sphere of the transformation of the individual into the subject, because he or her is able to become the subject, and the collective organization of the subject properly, the political subject itself, this relation is always the very difficult and problematic point. If we have no success for this point, we have a complete separation between, on one side, a sort of negative revolt, just the beginning of the transformation of the individual in subject by the refusal of the world as it is. So we have rebels in general, without any affirmative vision of the new world. And on the other side, we have the progressive death of all forms of organization, of collective organization, because they are separated from subjectivation. And in fact, it's a very, very difficult problem. And we can affirm that maybe today, and for our world, it is unsolved. It is unsolved. But you know, in politics, it's the same that in mathematics. There exist problems, for the moment, unsolved. Open problems for everybody to propose new forms of relationship between subjectivation and the subjective process. This, this point has been the contents of my first philosophical book. My first philosophical book, which is Theory of the Subject. Theory of the Subject, which has been published in 1982. 1982. It's a sort of result of all the sequence of the 60s and the 70s. And I speak of this book now because it's the contents of this book is precisely, exactly, the question of the relationship between subjectivation and the subject as such, the collective subject. If you want, between the militant and the party, in the classical terms. The militant, which is the individual in the position of subjectivation, and the party, which is the collective organization. Now, what is the history of theory of the subject? The beginning is two small books, small militant books, written during the 70s. Theory of Contradiction. I published Theory of Contradiction in 1975. And about ideology in 1976. And you see, Theory of Contradiction, about ideology, we are exactly in the heart of the problem. Theory of contradiction, what is dialectics? What is the relationship between negativity and affirmation? And about ideology, it's the question of subjectivation. So it was, but it's small books with activist determination. And during the second part of the 70s, I give a seminar in the Université Paris 8, and this seminar is also the birth of a theory of the subject. In fact, this seminar was very often transformed in meeting, protest, action in the streets, and so on. Very often. Sometimes we are in a room and we speak of philosophy and politics. But very often we are outside doing many strange things in the streets against the banks of United States, launching bombing on the cops and so on. During the 60s and the 70s, I had been arrested 13 times, generally in the morning. The cops come and many reunions, many militant works were during the night. So in the morning, the cops were assured to find her. It was not so. It was. We can. I part of all that with humor, naturally, but it was not always very happy situation. I have also been condemned to 1 year of prison with sursis. And I say that to explain that it was really a new life it was not only discussion, abstract discussion. It was really inside the political process of these years. That is really the conflict. Even us, we in our organization was not on the line of armed action. We are against the line of armed action. We are thinking that armed action was not appropriate to the situation of France. Naturally, armed action was a necessity in Vietnam and so on, but in France, we have an analysis of the situation, and the conclusion was, well, it's not, we cannot prepare immediately armed insurrection, it's a fiction. We have the conflict. It was difficult to have a protest without some fight against police and so on. And so it's also the experience of what is the political existence of contradiction, of real contradiction, not only contradiction in the words, but the process, the concrete process of contradiction, not only against the state, but against some political enemies, which were also applied. For example, we have had big fights against the classical Communist Party, because the Communist Party, the old Communist Party, was a strong organization. And when we went to factories, for example, to organize workers, it was very often a big conflict with the militants of the old Communist Party. So I explain all that to see that the question of rupture, the question of negativity, the question of conflict, the question of armed action, and finally the question of the very nature of contradiction, and finally the question of relationship between subjectivation and the subjective process was question which was immediately real questions and not philosophical or abstract questions. So, some point concerning the book. The point of theory of the subject, which has been finally translated in English, so we can have the book, theory of the subject, the point of this book finally is to propose a complete framework for a new theory of the political subject. I use naturally Marx, Lenin, and Mao, and I use our proper experience, concrete experience, but also Mallarmé, Lacan, and some others, and a small bit of mathematics. And finally, I organize dialectics between subjectivation, which is the birth of a new subject, and subjective process, which is the continuity of this subject. You know, the point is to find the articulation between the birth of the subject, of the new subject, and the continuity of this subject. If you have ideology without new form of organization, you can have subjectivation, but not the subject process, not the continuity of the new subject. No. And finally, and it is why I was described something here, I propose a theory of the subject with 4 concepts. I propose to say that the negative part of subjectivation is anxiety. Anxiety, which is the trouble concerning the real, which is the beginning of the possibility to a rupture with the real in a negative form. And the positive part of subjectivation I name courage. Courage. So the constitution of subjectivation, and so the subjective matter, if you want, of ideology, is relationship between anxiety and courage. Anxiety, if you want, is the obscure part of revolt. It's trouble, indecision, fear. But also, if we are more in psychoanalysis, it's also the part of the death drive in the revolt. The part of the death drive, the part of the fascination by negativity. And you know, there is something in the pure revolt, which is on the side of death drive, certainly. Because it's also the refusal of the life as it is. We cannot have the will for a new life without that sort of refusal of the life as it is. And so there is a negative part, and the subjective dimension of this negative part is anxiety. But the transformation, the positive transformation, is courage. So we can say something like that. A subjectivation is always the transformation of anxiety in courage. And on the other side, the negative part of the subjective process, of the continuity of the organization, if you want, is superego. Superego. As a you know, yes, that's the superego technology. Hmm?
What was the word? Is it satiric? Superego. Superego.
Superego, yes, I. Oops. It's a very beautiful diagram. So, you know, this part is the subjectivation. Actually, the subjectivation is something like the becoming of the process. Without subjectivation, we have no process. If the individual does not become a subject, there is no subject, naturally. So, the negative becoming, the pure sensibility of rupture and to be in front of the real, if you want, is for the individual is subjectivated as anxiety. But the domination, the subjective domination of anxiety, I name courage. And in fact, What is courage? Courage is to accept the consequences of the rupture. We can be in the situation by anxiety, death drive, and so on, but if we accept positively the consequences of all that, it's a necessity to be courageous. So the relationship between anxiety and courage constitute the subjectivation as such. And it's the same thing for the process, because the process, which is the continuity, can be under the idea of a law, of a strict law. It has been the great difficulty of many organizations. But many organizations finally are a form of a new, very strict law. You must obey. And it was the case in many forms of political party in the revolutionary signification. But if we only must obey, in some sense, it's the death of subjectivation. Because if the subject is defined by the fact to obey, is naturally something like the death of courage. Because to obey is the negativity of the subjective courage. It's a passivity, the transformation of all that in a passivity. And so, but there is always something like a superego in the process of organization. We cannot escape. We cannot escape anxiety, but we cannot escape the superego. Why? Because the superego is precisely also the death drive at the level of organization. The reduction of the subject to a law, to a strict law, and to the necessity to obey. But what is beyond the superego is justice. Justice, which is finally the rule, the true rule of a new organization, not only of the strict and limited political organization, but of the social organization in general. So there is something like a subjective way, a sort of circulation, which is the complete process, anxiety, courage, superego, and justice, which is the definition of the subject. But what time is it? Oh. I can continue for a moment. And so, to recapitulate all that, to justify this diagram, the book uses different means, poetry, political reference, some part of mathematics, and so on. But the result is the simple diagram where finally a subject, a complete subject, is the complete system of contradiction between these four terms. Contradiction between anxiety and courage, contradiction between courage and superego, superego and justice, and so on. And so the life of the new subject and the composition of the new subject is always a relationship between these four terms. And we can say, naturally, there is two possibilities. There is two possibilities because if finally the dominant relationship is the relationship between anxiety and superego, under the law of the death drive, we can have an organization, certainly, but we can name this coalition fascism. That is the domination of the death drive. If the sublimation of the death drive, so something which is beyond the death drive, is victorious, we have something we can name communism. So the opposition between the classical opposition during all the next century between communism and fascism can be schematized in the complete theory of the subject. In some sense, if there had existed during the next century fascismus and communismus, in some sense, because in any case, it was the result of some form of subjectivation. Fascism is not at all like the democratic state in general. You know, fascism has militants. There is subjectivation in the fascism, the true fascism. And this subjectivation is very often subjectivation, popular subjectivation. There has been workers who have become militants of fascism, you know. And so we must explain not only the general form of subjectivation, but why the subjectivation is not always a positive one, not always in a direction of emancipation. But we can have subjectivation and subjective process which is in the direction of death drive. And if it is in the direction of death drive by a relation which escapes the final destination of justice, we have the return to identity. We have the return to identity. The subjectivation cannot be of universal nature. Justice is always that all this process is in the direction of universality. Because precisely we have the courage to assume the consequence, and you are not under a restricted law. So it's the direction of universality, it is why it's communismus. But if there is something like domination of the part of the death drive in the process, whereas fascismus, that is the return to pure identity. It is why fascismus is always nationalism, racialism, and so on. Because it's ideological subjectivation, but which is finally a failure to go to the term of subjectivation, which is by necessity the universality of humanity as such. And so this diagram explains many things. There are other possibilities. You can exercise yourself to read the diagram in many fashions. For example, you can apply this diagram to artistic creation. It's a perfectly possibility, but you do that yourself. And you can also apply this diagram to the process of love. Oh, we recognize immediately anxiety, love, superego, and finally, love when it is really in its proper universality, that is love as justice, finally, as justice to the two, true justice to the minimal part. Love is the smallest communism. That and it's exactly inside that sort of determination. So it was finally my lesson of the first and the second point, my philosophical lesson of the first and the second point. Finally, we have a big revolt of ideological nature. You have people war with strong organization, armed organization, and so on. We have all that at the scale of the world itself. And philosophically, we can say that the very difficult problem is the relationship between subjectivation and the process subjective. And the difficulty is to at the end to escape fascism, to open the way to communism, or something like that. That is also, in other terms, to escape the strongness of identity, to open the way to universality. Or, if you want, to escape the strongness of difference, to open the way to equality. And I can open the way to the third term, the big strikes of the workers. Alors, the big strikes of the workers was a phenomenon in three countries: Italy, France, and China. Three countries with a strong communist tradition. We must remark this point. What has been the problem when we have this revolt of workers, which at the beginning are not at all the same phenomena as the revolt of students? There is something common in the time, but not in the substance. So all the point has been to organize a direct relationship between intellectuals, educated youth, and workers, and to create new forms of organization beyond generally the old and conservative Communist Party. And you know, we have here a new problem, which is not reducible to this diagram, which is the creation of something new between two different processes. They to create, in some sense, a new form of equality. A new form of equality. Equality between intellectuals and workers. But what is equality between intellectuals and workers? It has been the big problem during all these years. And we have some local victories concerning this problem, and the final failure. So the problem is not solved, unsolved. And it has been the case in Italy, in China, and in France, in completely different contexts. We have had something like 20 years of experience. 20 years of experience with local victories, really. We have had new organization. We have experimented the possibility of a direct and equal relationship at the political level between young intellectuals and workers. And when it is said today that it has been a failure, it's false. It has been a final failure. It's not the same thing. Not the same. We did not transform the global political situation. It's true. With the beginning of the 80s, we have a counter-revolution, the liberal revolution. And we are not victorious during the second part of the history. But during 20 years, we have had experience of local victories of great interest, and which are very important lessons for the future. I say that because there is a strong propaganda to say that all that was an illusion, that all that was practically nothing at all, that the only truth was the truth of the strongness of capitalism world. And in fact, it was a defeat, it was a final failure, it's true, but it's the law of history. Before the Soviet Revolution of 1917, you have many historical failure of revolutions. So, the history of communism is not a question of some years. Maybe the years between the 60s and the 70s. It's a strategic history. After thousands and thousands years of domination of the world by a small group. The history of humanity is the history of the domination of humanity by small groups. Today. And it's the case today. Democracy is a pure fiction. In fact, we know perfectly that it's a small groups of bank politicians and so on. We are not in a democracy, we are in an oligarchy, strictly speaking. And so it's the capitalist oligarchy succeeds to other oligarchy during the whole history of humanity. This diagram is to indicate the way of justice, but it's a long process. It's a long process, and in a long process, local victories are very important. And the memory of the local victory is very important. And this is why the propaganda of the enemy is always to say that, oh, it was nothing at all. It was nothing at all. The 60s, the 70s, okay, oh, illusion. Illusion of the youth. And they were outside the true world. In some sense, it's true. We were outside the true world. That's precisely our point. To be outside. To find the outside. To not be under the law of inside. And to find something else. And this is why the true fundamental question was, is a political process is possible in new conditions which create equality between social groups completely different. And the laboratory of all that has been, during the 60s and the 70s and a part of the 80s, the laboratory has been the relationship between intellectual and workers. Absolutely. Because it was a law of the world that that sort of unity was impossible. And you know, Lacan explained that the real is the impossible. The real of the capitalism, the political real, is that everybody is in its corner of the society. You stay in your corner. And the worker in a factory is in his corner, and young students in the campus is his corner too. And relationship between the two, political relationship, direct political action with equality within them, does not exist. It is impossible. But we prove that it is possible. And even the failure does not destroy this lesson. The failure does not destroy this lesson. It is exactly like the story of the Commune of Paris. The Commune of Paris is 1871. Big event. The idea was it was impossible that the workers, with some intellectuals, take the power. It was a doubt. It is impossible. But the Commune de Paris has been the proof that it was possible. Certainly during 2 months. It was not a definitive victory. They had been crushed, 20,000 victims, so on. So it was a failure, a complete failure. But the lesson of this failure was precisely all the point for Lenin. A great part of the work of Lenin is a meditation concerning the reason of this failure. And so the failure was useful, absolutely useful for the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And after that, we can say, okay, but the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia has a sad destiny. At the end, the superego dominate justice, and so on. We can say all that. Okay, but the point is that what was impossible was in fact possible. And the meditation of the failure was a decisive point to create the new possibility. And so I must say to you concerning the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, and notably the question of the new organization in which intellectuals and workers are in concrete equality and direct relationship is possible. And me or Cécile Venter, who is here, can witnesses of this point. We can witness of this point, that it is possible. And not only it is possible, but in some sense, it is something glorious. It is something exceptional, something remarkable, and something which is a great pleasure in existence, intellectual and concrete existence. When you have an assembly with workers, intellectuals, and we have discussion, profound discussion, and we have finally unity, political unity. You have a common decision. We decide what we must do, and so on. And you are here, me and the other French intellectuals, and you have workers coming from Algeria, from Mali, and so on. We have comrades who cannot write, who cannot read a line, but they sing something very strong, and we write that they sing, and so on. And it's a glorious moment. I say that to you. It's a glorious moment. It's not at all. After that, we can say, okay, you don't take the power. Certainly, certainly. It has been a final failure, and this experience is. And my philosophy, my conviction, is completely a result of this experience. We cannot completely understand being an event with mathematics and so on, okay? But the birth of all that, the subjectivation of all that, is really the possibility of something like a new political subject. And a new political subject with two determinations. First, a new relationship between subjectivation and organization, between ideology and organization. And second, the possibility to organize at a level of equality a completely different person, completely different individuals, and notably its secretariat. Workers, and workers coming from stranger countries and intellectuals of our cities. And when we do that, and when we have a local success in doing that, you are practically in another world. You are outside. And it's my experience of the cave of Plato, you know, the famous cave of Plato. The cave of Plato, where humanity in something like an obscurity, don't have any clear idea and obey to the law of the cave. And all the question is to go outside. But how we can go outside? What is the outside? The outside is the outside of justice, naturally. The cave is the superego. The cave is the strong law, the potency of the law. And when we are in the cave, we must obey. We must obey. And so it's also the discovery of a new freedom with equality. And my experience when we were doing that sort of new political process, when we are really with the others in equality, under a common idea, finally. Because when we are different, what is common is the idea. Under the common idea, we are in equality with the others. And the feeling of all that is we are outside. We are outside the cave. We are really outside the cave. And when we have been outside the cave, it's very difficult to return in the cave. Very difficult to return in the cave. And it's my conclusion for today. If I having the possibility to write big books of philosophy, essays of politics, play of theater, it's from the point of view of the possibility to be outside. Naturally, in some sense, I am inside. I am not a prophet, not at all. I am inside. But I am inside with the point of view of the possibility to be outside. And it is exactly that that Plato explains. When you are outside, says Plato, you must return to the cave. It's a duty. You must return to the cave to say to the people which are out inside that there is a possibility to be outside. It's possible. Maybe it's difficult. Maybe it's not immediately. Maybe it's tomorrow or in 1 century. But it's possible. And to live inside with the possibility to be outside, it's another life. Another life inside. You know? And it's the great lesson of these red years. The red years has been a political failure, but in some sense, there has been the possibility of a subjective victory. Thank you.
Yeah, they're still with us. So we could do live questions now, or next day. It's not actually on.
Hello? Okay, great. So, okay, so again, the method will be the same. Thank you, Professor Badiou, for brilliantly working through those years of your life. And also, I love how the dimensions are working here, not just in terms of the self as a subject, subjectification, but also in terms of his own life and his meditation on the quote, lesson of the failure of the unity between the intellectual and the worker. Um, so fantastic. Right now, what we'll do with questions is the following. If you can write out your questions, then I will hand them to Professor Badiou. And then tomorrow morning, again, just like today, or sorry, Thursday, because tomorrow is Professor Badiou's day off. And so Thursday we'll reconvene, and then we'll begin with questions. For those of you who are on the Hangouts from around the world listening in, can you please message me your questions? And then I will forward them to Professor Badiou. Without further ado, then we will call a complete closure for today's seminar, unless there's any outstanding logistical questions. Yes. Good question. So although tomorrow Professor Badiou, he's been very busy because he's been doing the film about his life as well as teaching this seminar. So he needs a break. Tomorrow is his break. However, the seminar will continue with Professor Asfar. Are you presenting tomorrow? Yes. And Professor Jason Adams will be giving a talk. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it'll be more of a conversation.
Conversation.
The basic theme is Badiou and the global. So we're gonna take the global in Global Advanced Studies, Global Center for Advanced Studies, and think about that in relation to Badiou's theory of the universal. And so it'll just be kind of a discussion, and Asfar has some really great thoughts on that, and I have a few thoughts too. So we'll see.
Great.
Yeah.
So that's what will happen tomorrow. So come prepared to talk and discuss. That would be great. Okay, and then now it will be time for lunch.
Yeah, and so from 2 to 4, we have a reservation for up to 18 people. Previously, it seemed like about 12 people raised their hand and said they wanted to go. And I've just received a message from Che Olga. It's a Haitian restaurant in Easttown. It's right by Yesterdog and Billy's, and they've said that they want us to bring cash only for today. So if you could stop at an ATM or something, but it's wonderful food. Yeah, it's from 2 to 4 today, and the address is 1441 Wealthy Street, Southeast. No. Does anyone have a program? Elk Brewing. So Elk Brewing, the idea being, so we go from lunch from 2 to 4, kind of a late lunch, early dinner, and then have a little break, and then we stay in the same region of town, which is also on Wealthy Street. Elk Brewing is right beside Johnny B's and a couple other places. But if you just follow the address, you could even walk. You could walk between the two places.